Here in India, we have two fundamental rights, both written into our constitution, that are on a direct collision course. One protects a community's right to build and run its own schools. The other protects every single child's right to an education. So when they clash, which one gives way? This really complex question is at the heart of a new Supreme Court battle. And believe me, the answer is going to shape the future for millions of children.
So let's just put the question out there, plain and simple. Can one fundamental right actually override another? Can a minority community's right to manage its own schools outweigh a child's right to a quality education? Now, this isn't just some academic debate. This is a real, high-stakes battle playing out right now in our Supreme Court. And whatever they decide is going to send ripples through the entire country's education system.
So what kicked all of this off again? Well, just this year, the Supreme Court did something pretty significant. They decided to reopen a case that everyone thought was settled a decade ago. By questioning whether minority schools should be exempt from the Right to Education Act, the court has basically hit the reset button, putting the entire issue of educational standards and rights right back in the national spotlight.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with the right that's now under scrutiny. Then we'll decode the RTE Act itself. We'll look at the two rights that are in conflict, examine the big 2014 judgment that set the stage, and then ask, why are we revisiting it now? Finally, we'll talk about the tough job of balancing the scales.
Okay, first up, a right under scrutiny. Now, let me tell you, it is a huge deal anytime the highest court in the land decides to question one of its own major rulings. I mean, the whole system is built on precedent, on stability. So for the court to take this step, the judges must feel this is an issue of massive national importance. And that's exactly what is happening here.
And listen to the court's concern, because the wording is so important. They're not just worried about getting kids into schools, they're worried about the quality of education they get once they're inside. They're asking a really sharp question. If a whole category of schools is exempt from national quality standards, are we accidentally creating an unequal system? This is a huge shift in thinking, from focusing on the rights of the institution to protecting the rights of the child.
Now, to really understand what's at stake, we need to decode the law that's at the very center of this storm. The Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act, or as everyone calls it, the RTE Act. If you don't get this law, you can't really get the conflict.
So, what is the RTE Act? Well, before 2009, education was something the government was supposed to aim for, a goal. But the RTE Act did something revolutionary. It turned that goal into a legally enforceable fundamental right for every single child in India from age 6 to 14. You can think of it as the legal muscle, the actual rule book that makes the constitutional promise of education a reality.
And this right didn't just appear out of thin air. It was a long journey. It really kicked off in 2002 with the 86th Amendment, which put a new article in the Constitution, Article 21A, saying the state has to provide education. But a right on paper needs a framework to work in the real world. That framework, the detailed RTE Act, was passed in 2009 and finally rolled out across the country in 2010.
Now, the part of the act everyone knows, the part that's most debated, is this number, 25%. The law says that all private, non-minority schools have to reserve a quarter of their seats for kids from economically weaker and disadvantaged backgrounds. I mean, the goal was audacious, to mix up our classrooms, break down social barriers, and make sure a family's bank balance didn't decide a child's future.
But it's about so much more than just that 25% quota. The Act tries to set a national minimum standard for what a school should be. It lays out rules for things like having a library and a playground. It says you can't have more than 30 students for every one teacher. It requires that all teachers prove they're qualified by passing the teacher eligibility test. And it bans things like charging huge donation fees for admission or using physical punishment. It's basically a whole rulebook for a safe and effective school.
And it's exactly those rules, those detailed standards, that lead us right to the heart of the constitutional clash. Because you have one fundamental right, trying to create a uniform standard for all kids, butting heads with another fundamental right designed to protect the independence of certain institutions.
And here it is, the legal tug-of-war, plain and simple. On one side, you've got Article 21A, the child's right to education, which is the engine behind the RTE Act. And on the other side, you've got Article 30. This gives religious and linguistic minorities the right to set up and, this is the key word, administer their own schools. It was put there to ensure they could protect their unique culture and language. So what happens when the state's rules under 21A clash with the school's right to self-administration under Article 30? Whose right comes out on top?
Well, the Supreme Court actually tried to answer that very question back in 2014. The answer came in a landmark case that has pretty much been the law of the land for the last 10 years. It's called the Pramati judgment.
And this one line from the judgment really gets to the heart of their thinking back then. The court basically said you can't force the 25% quota on a minority institution. Their logic was that if you force a school created for a specific community to change its student mix so drastically, you'd erode their minority character and mess with their right to run their own affairs, the very right that Article 30 is supposed to protect.
The result of this was a complete blanket exemption. The court didn't just strike down the quota for these schools. They said the entire RTE Act, with all its rules about teachers and infrastructure and everything else, simply does not apply to minority schools. Period. Whether they got government money or not. In that 2014 showdown, the right of the institution clearly won, and that was the law until now.
So why on earth are we revisiting this verdict now? After a decade, what new arguments could possibly be strong enough to make the Supreme Court say, hold on, let's take another look? The answer, it seems, lies in a new way of looking at what rights really mean.
The court's new perspective is a game changer. What the judges are suggesting today is that no right, not even a fundamental one, is absolute. They're floating the idea that the right to administer a school can't be used as a free pass to ignore basic quality standards that could end up hurting the very children the school is supposed to be educating.
Okay, so let's step away from the legal jargon for a second. What does this exemption actually mean on the ground? What's the real-world impact for the students and teachers in these schools every single day?
This table just lays it all out, doesn't it? It's so clear. Because of the exemption, a minority school doesn't have to keep 25% of its seats for underprivileged kids. It doesn't have to hire teachers who've passed the national eligibility test. It doesn't have to meet national standards for infrastructure. And it doesn't have to maintain that 1-to-30 student-teacher ratio. This right here is what's worrying the court now. This exemption has basically created a bypass around an entire system of quality control.
So where do we go from here? How do you even begin to solve an issue this complicated? Well, it means we have to try and balance the scales. That involves looking at the arguments on both sides, understanding the massive challenges our entire education system is facing, and figuring out a possible path forward.
And the arguments on both sides are powerful, you have to admit. Supporters of the exemption say it's vital to protect the unique cultural identity of these institutions from too much government control. But those against a blanket exemption say that a child's right to a good education is universal. It shouldn't matter what kind of school they go to. They argue this exemption creates an unfair system where some kids are denied basic quality standards.
And we have to remember, this whole legal debate isn't happening in a perfect world. It's happening in an education system that is already facing huge problems. Take this one, for example. Across India right now, there are over 1 million, that's 10 lakh, vacant teaching positions in government schools. 1 million. How do you enforce strict teacher qualifications when you're facing a crisis like that?
And the problems don't stop there. States are struggling to pay for the RTE Act, which costs them about 50,000 crore rupees every year. And even with all the kids in school, the results aren't great. The latest ASIT report found that a quarter of our youth between 14 and 18 can't even read a simple Class 2 textbook. Plus, the social integration goal has had its own issues, with many students from the quota facing discrimination. These are the hard realities that make this issue so tough.
So what is the way forward? Well, first things first. A larger bench of the Supreme Court needs to give a final, clear ruling so we can end all this uncertainty. Second, a lot of experts are pointing to a kind of middle path. The idea is to apply the quality-focused parts of the RTE Act, like teacher standards and safety norms, to all schools, but still let minority institutions have their freedom in administration and admissions. And third, maybe the most important step of all, is for all of us to shift the conversation away from which right wins to how we can achieve our shared goal, a great education for every single child in India.
Make no mistake, the stakes here are incredibly high. The Supreme Court's final decision will set the direction for our schools for years to come. It really comes down to a fundamental choice. Do we move towards a single, uniform standard of quality for every child, no matter where they study? Or do we continue with a system where the quality of a child's education can depend on the type of school they attend?
And all of this leaves us with one final, massive question to think about. In this delicate balancing act between a community's rights and a child's future, where does the buck stop? Who has the ultimate responsibility for making sure our kids get a quality education? Is it the school they go to, or is it the state whose job it is to protect the future of every single citizen? The answer to that will define a generation.